Late at night, under the dazzling stage lights and the cheers of hundreds in the audience, a 94-year-old man walked slowly into a television show notorious for its ruthless ambush interviews. He hadn't come to be adored. He hadn't come to justify himself. And he certainly hadn't come to reclaim the spotlight of a bygone era. He came simply to listen, and if possible, to be heard. Fiona Carrington, a progressive talk show host famed for her razor-sharp confrontations, was already preparing her script, set to dismantle her guest in what many predicted would become a viral moment. To her, this man symbolized the past, rigid, outdated, and out of touch, a fallen giant, long overdue to collapse. And as expected, the interview began with bursts of laughter, biting sarcasm, and heavily loaded questions. Fiona believed she had full control of the game, but then that old man simply responded with a soft smile and a single sentence that silenced the entire studio. Integrity isn't about being popular. It's about living with yourself. No one laughed anymore. No one clapped. Only silence remained thick, still as if the entire room was listening for the first time, not with their ears, but with their hearts. And then something no one expected happened. The man invited to be mocked became the one who moved the audience to tears. The man dismissed as outdated made an entire young generation reflect on themselves. They weren't just hearing about a life story, they were seeing their own. Every time they doubted themselves, every time they wanted to give up, every time they betrayed their own values just to be accepted. The question now was no longer, what did he say? But why did we have to wait for a man nearly 100 years old to remind us of decency? And if you've ever felt overlooked, because you weren't trendy anymore, because you didn't speak as loudly as others, because you still held on to values the world calls outdated, then this story was meant for you. Because sometimes what makes the world pause isn't the roar of applause, but a quiet sentence from someone still brave enough to live truthfully. Clint Mason isn't the kind of name trending on social media. He doesn't chase what's popular. He doesn't own a TikTok channel with millions of views. He doesn't grace the covers of magazines curated for Gen Z. But if you've ever watched the dusty cowboy films of the 1960s, if you grew up with the image of a lone rider crossing wild frontiers to stand up for justice, then maybe Clint was a part of your childhood. He was once the face of grit, the kind of man who didn't talk much, but when he did stand up, the world listened. And now, at 94, while most of his peers have stepped off life's stage, Clint still walks slowly, steadily, just as he's lived for decades. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Fiona Carrington reigns as queen of the nighttime talk circuit. Brilliant, sharp, always leading the charge in every debate. She wasn't afraid to challenge icons, question long-standing values, or take down anyone bold enough to sit across from her if they came unprepared. Fiona was the voice of a new generation where right and wrong were defined by public resonance, where success was measured by views, shares, and viral speed. When the production team suggested inviting Clint Mason to appear on the show Spotlight, Fiona didn't need long to decide. "Perfect," she said. "An outdated conservative icon riddled with flaws. My audience will love this." To her, this was going to be a televised hunt. To him, it was simply a conversation. And so these two people from two different worlds, two different rhythms of life, two different understandings of truth agreed to meet on the same stage. One came armed with questions sharp as blades. The other carried the calm of a man who's lived long enough to know he doesn't need to win an argument. Neither of them, not even themselves, could have known that the upcoming interview wouldn't just reshape how the audience saw the world. It would reshape them in ways they never expected. That night, the Spotlight studio glowed brighter than usual. Hundreds of audience members filled the seats, their quiet laughter laced with anticipation. Everyone could feel it. Something unforgettable was going to happen tonight, not because Clint Mason was some trending name, but because of how the show had teased it. An aging monument goes head-to-head with the voice of modern progress. On one side stood a symbol, on the other, a movement. And as always, the modern world loved nothing more than to watch a symbol fall. Back in the dressing room, Fiona Carrington stood before the mirror, adjusting every strand of hair with precision. On the table beside her lay a thick folder of notes, controversial quotes from Clint, outdated interviews, roles he had played that reeked of old-school conservatism. She read each line as if sharpening a blade before a hunt. "Don't give him too much space to explain himself," her assistant reminded. Fiona gave a cold, confident smile. "Relax. Tonight, the stage is mine." In another room, soundproofed from all the noise, Clint Mason sat quietly. In his hands, a simple glass of water. In front of him, a small TV screen displaying the show's logo. No cue cards, no buzzing assistants. Just him and the stillness of a man who knew exactly who he was. "You sure about this, Jack?" the young assistant asked, still unable to hide his concern. "Sure," Clint replied, eyes gazing off into the distance, his voice soft as a whisper. "This isn't a battle. It's just a conversation." As the theme music echoed and the stage lights slowly came up, Fiona stepped out with her signature commanding presence. The audience applauded thunderously, part out of habit, part in anticipation of the verbal sparring they'd come to expect. Fiona opened with a few light-hearted stories, then began to build toward introducing her guest. A man who's been alive nearly a century, a weathered monument of old Hollywood, and a symbol of an era where women were still expected to stay silent. The applause grew louder. She smiled, poised for the next blow, and just as she introduced him, Clint stepped onto the stage. No spotlight, no help. He didn't need it. Just a simple blazer, slightly worn leather shoes, and a steady, unhurried stride. He shook Fiona's hand firm, courteous. No one in the studio realized. That handshake was the moment the balance of the stage quietly began to shift. Fiona asked the first question, subtly jabbing at his age. Clint responded with a relaxed smile and a simple line. "Thank you for having me. Your audience is very lively." Immediately, something in the air paused. He didn't snap back. He didn't attack. He simply spoke calmly, like still water. That silence wasn't in Fiona's script, nor was it part of anyone's expectations in the room. A night everyone anticipated would be tense and thrilling began to drift toward stillness. But it was in that stillness that people, for the first time, began to truly hear the truth. After the polite introductions, Fiona Carrington quickly returned to her usual commanding presence. She adjusted her posture, leaned forward, her eyes flashing like an arrow about to be released. "Clint," she began, her tone sweet, though the blade was already hidden between the words. "You've been in this industry for over 6 decades. Have you ever thought, maybe it's time for the younger generation to take over and for you to rest?" The audience burst into laughter, not entirely because the question was witty, but because of the way it was wrapped in such a sugar-coated jab. Fiona raised an eyebrow, waiting for the reaction. Clint Mason didn't frown. He didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, squinting as if considering his answer, then replied gently, "I've always believed. Work isn't about age. If you still have something meaningful to contribute, then keep doing it. Being young doesn't automatically make you right, and being old doesn't automatically make you wrong." His words didn't make anyone laugh, but they slowed the laughter. A few hesitant claps broke out, not out of admiration, but contemplation. Fiona paused for just a beat, but quickly fired back. "But you can't deny. Your films, though iconic, are filled with outdated portrayals. Men with guns, women portrayed as fragile, people of color reduced to the background. Have you ever considered that maybe you were part of the problem?" The question hit like a bullet exploding in the center of the studio. The entire room held its breath, while the camera zoomed tightly onto Clint's face. He didn't dodge, he didn't rush to respond. He simply breathed, slow and steady, as if stepping inward, then spoke, softly. Film reflects its time. It tells the story of what people thought, felt, and feared in that moment. Looking back now, we may see that it was wrong, and we should. But rather than denying the past, I believe what matters is learning from it. No progress is made by erasing history. This time, the audience didn't laugh. There was no applause, just silence, as if they had just heard something real. Fiona furrowed her brow, a strange sensation creeping in. She was used to steering the emotional tide, used to applause after every pointed question, but this time, silence held the upper hand, unwilling to back down. She pressed on. "What about politics? You've publicly voiced views so conservative they sparked outrage. Weren't you afraid of losing the admiration of your longtime fans?" Clint smiled, not a triumphant grin, but the kind that comes from having lived. "I never chose popularity. I chose honesty. And honesty isn't always welcomed. But if you have to trade in who you are just to be liked, was that affection ever real to begin with?" Fiona went still, and the room began to shift, from laughter to listening, from judgment to understanding. For the first time in her years on television, Fiona felt like she was no longer steering the show, but being steered by a man she once assumed was outdated, and the interview had just crossed the line from entertainment to awakening. The air in the studio seemed to soften, not from fatigue, but because everyone had begun listening with their hearts. Fiona, though still in the host's chair, could feel the power quietly slipping from her hands. She looked at the man in front of her, still calm, still speaking in that steady, gentle voice. Yet somehow he had made the entire room fall into a strange, peaceful hush. She hesitated slightly, then half-joked, half-tested. "You seem awfully comfortable with being misunderstood." Clint gave a slight nod, his eyes deep. "Like an old river's bend, I've lived long enough to know. There are things that don't need explaining. They just need to be lived, honestly." Then he leaned back gently in his chair and asked a question, one no one expected. "Would you mind if I shared a little story?" Fiona looked momentarily caught off guard, then nodded. "As long as it's not a scene from an old cowboy movie," she teased gently. Clint simply smiled, and then he began to speak. "When I was young, I worked as a dock laborer, a carpenter, a night shift truck driver. I didn't come to Hollywood chasing a dream. I came because I had nowhere else to go. At my first audition, They told me I had nothing. My voice was too quiet, my face too stiff, and I didn't have a single spark of star quality. The audience chuckled softly, not mockingly, but with something closer to affection. One director looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're not meant for the screen. You're never going to make anything of yourself." And for a full year after that, he was right. Fiona sat quietly now, her hands no longer reaching for the stack of cue cards. There were days I wanted to quit, days I stood outside casting rooms just to watch someone else get picked. But instead of walking away, I stayed. I started to learn not acting, but people. I watched how someone walked, how they looked at others, how they went silent when they were hurting. And I remembered. The audience began to sit a little straighter, not from tension, but from connection. Then, one day, a film crew needed a cowboy. Cheap, few lines. They picked me because I had a face that looked uncomplicated. That was my first break. And it was also the moment I realized opportunity doesn't come from shining. It comes from being ready when the light finally hits you. In the front row, a young woman quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. Fiona lowered her head. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to ask next. "I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back," Clint said softly. "I'm telling it because I think someone here tonight has also been told you're not good enough. And if a guy once told he had no spark at all can be sitting here today, then maybe you can keep going too." A wave of applause broke out, not to praise, but as a way of saying thank you. Thank you for a story so raw, so real, so human. Fiona gently gripped the edge of the table, her eyes on him no longer like an opponent, but like someone truly listening. From that moment on, the interview was no longer a game of win or lose. It became a conversation between two generations, two ways of living with something in the middle that everyone longed for: truth. The Spotlight studio was no longer echoing with sarcastic laughter. It had become something sacred, a space where one man, without raising his voice, had brought hundreds of people to complete silence. And in the center of that silence was Clint Mason, not as a faded star, but as a storyteller opening the door to his heart and inviting others to step in. Fiona, the woman who always knew how to control the narrative, now moved without a script. She asked slowly, not to challenge, but because she genuinely wanted to know. "You've spoken about resilience so many times. What does resilience mean to you?" Clint sat up straighter, his hands gently clasped in front of him. His face wasn't tense, but in his eyes there was a weight few could carry when speaking of pain. People often think resilience means never falling down. He began, never crying, never being weak, never backing off. But to me, that's a flawed definition. He looked down at the table, then raised his gaze slow. But certain resilience is knowing you will fall and still choosing to get up. It's knowing your heart might break and still choosing to love anyway. It's daring to walk into tomorrow, even when today was so brutal, it made you want to disappear. Fiona nodded, saying nothing. In the third row, a middle-aged man quietly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. No one in the audience shifted. No phones, no whispers. Just a rare, collective silence. In a world where everyone is usually just waiting for their turn to speak, Fiona continued, her voice softer now. "So, what helped you get back up during the hardest moments?" Clint smiled, not with sadness, not with pride, not success, not the applause, but the little things just enough to keep me from falling. He raised his hand, counting on each finger a friend who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, a father who forgave me when I messed up, a stranger's words at just the right time, a quiet morning after a sleepless night, and sometimes just the sound of wood knocking as I finished building a chair and it stood steady. Fiona sat motionless. No one, herself included, had expected that a legendary man who once rode horses and fired guns on screen could speak with such tenderness. Most people look for motivation from the outside, Clint continued, but real motivation comes from knowing why you're still here. Fiona asked slowly, and have you ever felt lost? Clint nodded. Many times, and I still can get lost. But whenever I do, I remind myself, don't look for shortcuts. Look for a reason to keep walking. A slow round of applause spread through the studio like a gentle wave rolling across the room. No one wanted Clint to speak faster. No one hoped for Fiona to strike back, because at that moment they didn't need an entertaining interview. They were witnessing a real conversation with someone who had truly lived. The atmosphere was thick with stillness when Fiona, as if awakening from a dream, decided to bring the interview back on track. She straightened in her seat, reached for the stack of notes she had long abandoned. Her voice no longer carried the edge of a blade, but still held the sharp clarity she was known for. Clint, if I may ask directly, she said, her gaze showing, for the first time, a flicker of hesitation. You've played dozens of cowboy roles, the hardened man, the gunslinger, cold, stoic, never shedding a tear. Many now call that the face of toxic masculinity. Do you think those roles helped shape a harmful image of what it means to be a man? The question sliced through the air like a sudden gust. A few audience members nodded slowly, as if it echoed thoughts they, too, had once carried. And everyone waited for Clint's reaction. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't defend. He simply nodded and replied in a steady voice. Without a trace of defensiveness, I understand why people think that. But if you only look at the surface, you'll miss the most important part. Fiona blinked, surprised. Clint leaned back, hands resting gently on his knees, as if recalling something ancient, yet never old to him. The men I played, they weren't perfect. They carried guns, drank whiskey, wore scars the camera didn't always show. But they didn't fight for the thrill. They fought for justice, to protect what was right, because no one else would stand up. He looked straight into Fiona's eyes, his voice deepening. If that's toxic, then maybe, just maybe, the world needs a little more of that kind of toxic people who do the right thing, even when they have to do it alone. The room was silent, utterly still. Fiona squinted slightly, no longer sure what was right, or how she had defined it. She let out a gentle line, almost like a breath. But isn't there a way to tell those stories with more humanity, without the violence? Clint nodded without resistance. I agree. And I also believe every era tells its stories in its own way. But the most important thing, it's not the gun or the saddle. It's why the gun was drawn in the first place. If you strip away the symbols, those characters were just people, trying to survive, trying to hold on to something decent in a world that was anything but. A young woman in the second row nodded, eyes rimmed with red. Fiona bit her lip. Not because she was out of questions, but because, in that moment, she saw something she had never quite considered before. Maybe Clint wasn't resisting progress. He just didn't believe in erasing the past and calling it reform. "Do you think the world today is heading in the right direction?" she asked next, and this time her voice was completely different. No attack, no twist, just the simple desire to understand. Clint spoke slowly, "I think. The world is moving very fast. But if you're moving without knowing where you're going, then speed only takes you further off course." The answer was simple, but it landed like a blow to the chest. Not violent, not sharp, just true. And sometimes that kind of truth is something no script could ever prepare for. Fiona straightened in her seat. No more note cards, no more probing glances. Just two people, one asking with sincerity, one answering with everything life had taught him. She hesitated for a moment, then asked Clint, "It said you once turned down a role for moral reasons. Is that true? Would you be willing to share what happened?" Clint nodded. His gaze seemed to drift back to a time when the world was still black and white and he was standing in the grey. That year, I was still young. My career wasn't stable. A contract came through a big role, well-funded film, respected director. The part I was offered was that of a war hero, on paper. He paused, the audience locked in, eyes fixed on him. But when I read the script more closely, I noticed something wasn't right. That character on the surface, a hero, but in his actions, he was cold, arrogant, full of contempt for others, and the way the film was written, audiences would have celebrated him as a symbol of America. Clint looked straight into the camera without flinching. I knew if I took the role, I'd become famous overnight. But I also knew if I did it, I'd be betraying myself. Fiona swallowed. She hadn't expected the story to go that far. I turned it down. People laughed, said I was crazy. The press called me difficult, picky, hard to work with. Even my agent dropped me. He gave a soft smile, not bitter, just like someone recounting something that happened, with no need to justify it anymore. I didn't get a role for 8 months after that. There were moments when I doubted myself. But then a new project came along, smaller, less money, but honest. In that role, I got to be myself, and the audience felt it. Fiona exhaled gently. She had never imagined that a simple turning down a role could carry the weight of an entire journey. People think success is about being praised, being seen. But I think success is when you can look in the mirror and the person staring back hasn't betrayed you. The room fell silent. No applause, because everyone was holding their breath. Fiona sat still for a long moment, then spoke. "I think a lot of us in this industry need to hear that, because sometimes we choose what's trending instead of what's right." Clint said nothing, just gave a quiet nod as if to say, "I understand." And strangely, in that moment, when no one was trying to win, when no one was trying to be clever, the conversation became the most real it had ever been. Not a battle between past and present, but a meeting between experience and the hunger to live rightly. After sharing about the role he turned down for moral reasons, Clint said nothing more, just sat there, silent, as if giving the audience a moment to catch up with their own hearts. Fiona kept looking at him, her eyes no longer curious, but quietly, unmistakably, respectful. And then, as if sensing something unspoken, she said softly, "You seem like someone who remembers the little things." Clint lifted his head and smiled. "It's the little things that keep us from falling apart on the biggest days." He leaned back. closed his eyes for a brief moment as if searching through his memory, then began to speak. There was this one time. I was filming in Arizona. The sun was blazing, the ground so hot it softened the soles of my boots. I was exhausted, irritable, and honestly, I was ready to walk off set. Too many things were going wrong. The audience listened not just out of curiosity, but because they sensed. This wasn't really a story about Arizona. I wandered off behind the set, just trying to catch my breath alone. And that's when I saw an older man, sitting in the shade, repairing his own shoes. He was part of the crew logistics, I think. He didn't know I was watching. He was singing softly, his voice hoarse, slow, each word falling like drops onto the sun-baked dirt. Clint paused, smiling faintly. I asked him, "Those shoes are falling apart. Why not just toss them?" He looked up, smiled without stopping his work, and said, "They've been with me through a lot. If they're worn, I patch them up. What matters is my feet still want to keep walking." Fiona said nothing. Neither did the audience. Only the sound of soft breaths, as if someone, somewhere, was trying to hold something in their chest. Clint continued, his voice neither loud nor dramatic, just steady, like a heartbeat echoing slow and low. From that day on, I never called a scene a hassle again. I stopped complaining about the heat on set, or props being the wrong color, because I remembered there are people quietly stitching up old shoes just to keep walking. He looked straight at the audience, not like a speaker, but like a man telling the truth. Success doesn't come from great things. It comes from your ability to see beauty in what's small, worn, and quiet. Fiona leaned slightly toward him, then asked in a near whisper, "Did you ever go back to find that man?" Clint nodded slowly. "I did. But the film wrapped, the crew disbanded, and he was gone. I didn't know his name. I had no number. But every time I put on my shoes, I remember what he said." A young woman in the audience reached out, quietly grasping the hand of the person next to her, eyes shimmering with tears. Fiona remained still, perhaps for the first time in her career as a host. She felt there was truly nothing left to say. And then, like a breeze drifting through a forest after rain, Clint spoke softly. "People keep searching for that one moment that'll change their life. But sometimes what changes you is just a stranger, a quiet sentence and a pair of worn-out shoes." After the story of the man mending his shoes, the studio fell into a stillness so rare, so complete, that few shows ever come close to touching it. No laughter, no polite applause, just the full-bodied silence of people realizing, maybe, they'd been living too fast to notice the simplest things. Fiona no longer tried to hold on to her sharp edge. She looked at Clint for a long, unguarded moment, then exhaled as if finally letting go of a mask she had worn for too long. "Clint," she said, her voice slower now. "Stripped of performance, I had prepared dozens of sharp questions to challenge you. I thought I could make you defensive, get the audience to laugh, come out on top." She paused. For the first time, the strong, unshakable host had nothing else to say. Clint just smiled gently, without judgment. Fiona looked down, fingers flipping through a few pages of notes that now felt meaningless. Then she looked up, eyes slightly red, not from tears, but from having brushed up against something real. "You know, I used to believe I had to be sharp to survive, smarter, faster, tougher than anyone who sat across from me." The studio was silent, not because of a dramatic twist, but because everyone like Fiona had just realized something they'd never quite seen before. "But when you sat here, speaking so calmly, slowly, never trying to prove anything. I understood something, that maybe the strongest thing isn't logic or argument, but the peace that comes from a life lived true. Clint didn't interrupt. He didn't need to say anything, because he knew sometimes silence is the most sacred gift we can offer the person in front of us. Fiona took a deep breath and then smiled. Not the kind of smile meant to save face, but the kind of someone who had just been set free. "Thank you," she said. "Not for clever answers, but because you never tried to be right and still made me look back at myself." Clint looked at her. His gaze held no victory, no triumph, only recognition and a deep, quiet understanding. "We don't always need to be right, Fiona. We just need to always be real." That sentence, delivered without drama, was enough to make everything — the cameras, the audience, the crew — pause. And in that very second, something strange happened. The woman who had once believed she was the one controlling the show had just learned her deepest lesson the moment she let go of control. The stage lights dimmed, the cameras shifted. The host bowed her head in gratitude to her guest. The taping ended. But no one in the studio stood up right away. Not because they were tired, but because they weren't ready to leave something that had just touched something deep inside them. The applause rose, not loud, not forced. It was soft, genuine, and warm. Clint Mason gave a gentle nod, then stood. He shook hands with each member of the crew. No airs, no performance, just a man, thanking those who had given him a space to speak from the heart. In a corner backstage, a young cameraman hesitated, then stepped forward, eyes still glistening. "I just wanted to say, for the first time in my life, I watched an interview that didn't leave me feeling drained." Clint smiled. Sometimes we're not tired from doing too much. We're tired from hiding too much. The young man nodded, then gripped Clint's hand like making a quiet promise to himself. Meanwhile, Fiona walked slowly back to her dressing room. The door closed behind her, shutting out the noise of the world. She sat down in front of the mirror. Her makeup was still perfect. No smudges, no smears. But the eyes staring back at her were different. No longer the woman who controlled every game, but someone finally sitting across from herself for the first time in a very long while. Fiona pulled out the old stack of notes, the carefully crafted questions, the clever gotcha moments. She read them over and realized they didn't matter anymore, not because Clint had deflected or outwitted her, but because he had never played that game to begin with. Fiona picked up a pen, not to highlight or strategize, but to write a single sentence just for herself. "I don't need to win if I can be real." She looked at the words and softly repeated them. "I don't need to win if I can be real." That line wasn't meant for the show, wasn't meant for the audience. It was a whisper between a woman and the part of herself she had long forgotten. Outside, the audience finally began to leave. No boisterous laughter, no buzzing chatter, just whispers, reflections, and thoughtfulness. A father held his child's hand, telling a story about his own father, a man who forged knives for 30 years, never once famous, but deeply respected by all who knew him. A young woman posted online tonight, "I listened to an old man who spoke slower than I'm used to, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hit fast forward." In the control room, the producers looked at each other. No one said, "Which clip will go viral?" There was only one sentence spoken. We just captured something real. And in the quietest room of all, where there was no audience, no lights, no microphones, Clint Mason was washing his face, his eyes still bright with life. Not because he had won a confrontation, but because he had stayed true to himself, even on a stage designed to tear him down. He stepped out slowly. Jack, the young assistant, opened the car door and said softly, "I didn't think that interview would reach people that deeply." Clint got in, glanced back at the now darkened stage. Depth doesn't need volume. It only needs to be real. And the car rolled away quietly, carrying an old man, a man who didn't try to say what was right. He simply chose to say what was true. The next morning, social media flooded with clips from the night before. Not because it was more explosive than previous episodes, not because it had drama, but because it touched. One clip, barely 30 seconds long, of Clint Mason saying, "Integrity isn't about being popular. It's about living with yourself," was shared millions of times, not by celebrities, but by ordinary people trying to survive in a world so loud they could barely hear their own thoughts. In a small coffee shop in Texas, a newly graduated student replayed that clip 3 times. In a barber shop in Brooklyn, an old barber told his apprentice, "Listen to that man, not to learn how to talk, but how to live." And in a media boardroom, a content director stood up, closed her laptop, and said, "Today, we're meeting about truthful, not about trending." And at a small suburban high school, a teacher played a clip from the interview during class, then asked, "Has anyone here ever felt like they didn't matter just because they're quieter than others?" Many hands went up. In a world that values volume over depth, Clint Mason, with his slow, steady voice and zero need to prove anything, made people pause. Pause to remember that you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to trend to make an impact. And that, sometimes, a single sentence spoken by someone who lives with integrity can change an entire generation. For Fiona Carrington, that conversation wasn't just a successful broadcast. It was a turning point. For the first time in her career, she opened the next episode with a quiet admission, "I used to think I was strong because I always had the answer. But that day, he made me realize, true strength might be when you dare to listen even when it's uncomfortable, and dare to change even when it's inconvenient." The audience didn't clap right away. They just listened. They remained silent. And then, slowly, genuine applause rose, like gentle waves moving through something deep within them. And Clint, he didn't read the comments, didn't trend with a puffed chest. He simply returned to his ranch, brewed his morning coffee, walked his horse along the ridge, and finished the wooden table he'd started the week before. When the young assistant showed him the viral stats from the episode, Clint just smiled. "You know what makes me happiest." "What's that, sir?" "That it seems, even in the noise of the world, there are still people who want to hear something true. Leave a comment, not for anyone to understand, just for yourself. I choose to live true even when no one claps. Because you don't need to be the loudest or the smartest, just the one who's the most real. And maybe one day, you with a small act or a slow-spoken word will be the reason someone else doesn't give up. If you're still here, quiet, like us, then maybe this story was never just about a man named Clint Mason. Maybe it was about all of us, the ones who once lived true and were told we were outdated,